Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is Bleeding Kansas, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. In the last lesson, you learned about the Compromise of 1850, a deal that was made between pro-slavery and anti-slavery Americans regarding the admission of a new state, California. Today, we are going to look at another conflict over the exact same issue that the Compromise of 1850 was supposed to solve, and that was the admission of new states and whether or not they would allow slavery. Also, in 1850, a senator named Stephen Douglas proposed a new solution to this issue, and he called it popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that when a territory had enough people living in it to apply to become a state, the people living in the territory would vote on whether to become a free state or a slave state. Sovereignty means power, and popular means of the people. So popular sovereignty meant that the people in a territory would have the power to decide whether they would become a state with slavery or without it. And they would decide that by voting. That system sounds reasonable, but as we'll see, it didn't please everyone. Popular sovereignty became a reality in 1854 when the territories of Kansas and Nebraska were almost ready to become states. A new law was passed that year called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it said that the white men living in Kansas and in Nebraska would get to vote on whether to allow slavery. That's popular sovereignty. But wait, there was a problem here. You might remember that there was another compromise that had already been made back in 1820 called the Missouri Compromise. And that compromise had said that there would be no slavery allowed north of 3630 degrees latitude. That's all this land here on this map. But Kansas and Nebraska were part of that land. So in 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, it repealed or canceled the Missouri Compromise because it said that there could be slavery in lands north of 3630 if the majority of people in those lands voted for it. So lands that had previously been off limits to slavery could, because of popular sovereignty, now end up being slave states. And this made Northerners furious. Some Northerners took action and formed a new political party, which they called the Republican Party. The Republican Party's main goal was to prevent the expansion of slavery into new territories. Be careful here. The Republican Party's platform, its list of goals, did not propose to end slavery in states where it already existed. But it did propose to prevent the expansion of slavery. Its members believed that there should be no new slave states. The Republican Party is also called the Grand Old Party, or GOP. You've probably heard of this party. It's the same party that Abraham Lincoln led just a few years after it was formed, and it's the same party that is now led by Donald Trump. It all started in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The last term today is Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas refers to several different episodes of violence that occurred in a single year, 1856, all related to the question of slavery in Kansas. That year, the men in Kansas were supposed to vote on whether to have slavery or not. But as the day of the vote drew closer, people on both sides moved to Kansas just to influence the vote, and things got violent. On one side were anti-slavery people who moved to Kansas from northern states like Massachusetts. And on the other side were pro-slavery people who had mostly moved to Kansas from Missouri, which was a slave state right next to Kansas. The anti-slavery people called the pro-slavery people border ruffians, accusing them of having crossed the border from Missouri into Kansas just to support slavery. By the end of 1856, 200 people in Kansas had died from violence. Let's look at 3 of the violent events that occurred that year. The first event in Bleeding, Kansas is called the Sack of Lawrence. Lawrence was a town in Kansas where most people were anti-slavery. They opposed slavery. Lawrence was also home to an anti-slavery newspaper that printed articles encouraging people to vote against slavery. In May 1856, the border ruffians, those pro-slavery forces in Kansas, rode their horses into Lawrence at night, looted and destroyed several homes, burned down the newspaper building, and threw the newspaper's printing press into a river. No one was killed, but the town was completely destroyed. And this attack was called the Sack of Lawrence. The Sack of Lawrence led to 2 other violent events, and the first of those 2 is called the Potawatomi Massacre. Try saying that word, Potawatomi. Potawatomi. The Potawatomi Massacre was led by the man in this picture, John Brown. You will learn more about John Brown and the Potawatomi Massacre in class. And the last event is called Brooks's Caning of Sumner, and it took place in Congress in Washington, D.C., not in Kansas. But it was directly related to the violence in Kansas. Preston Brooks was a pro-slavery representative from South Carolina, and Charles Sumner was an anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts. One day after the sack of Lawrence, Sumner gave a speech that harshly criticized slaveholders, and in response, Representative Brooks badly beat Sumner with his gold-tipped cane. Sumner went into a coma and took months to recover. You will learn more about this event in class as well. Alright, now it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, rewind the video and look again. I will see you in class. Bye, students.